Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about critical reading and some of the readings that we have coming up for this unit. By this point you should have already watched the assigned TED videos and taken the video quizzes based on those videos. And if for whatever reason you missed one or more of those, it's important that you go back and make sure that you've watched whatever videos that you're missing. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. Number one, you can navigate to the TED website, which is at ted.com, and then you could open another tab and navigate to our syllabus and look at the titles that are in the video quiz that you missed or that are in the video quiz if you just want to watch the videos for your own reference. And so I would come back here and take that title or part of that title, and I just chose one of them. And I'll choose the one by Chris Hatfield. And I typed in blind in space and it came up with the correct video. Chris Hatfield, What I Learned from Going Blind in Space. And I click on that, I can watch the video there. I can also click on the transcript button, and the nice thing about this is a word-for-word transcript of everything that he says, and you can find this for most of the TED videos that we have in this unit. In fact, you can find this transcript for all of the videos except for the J.K. Rowling speech and for the Eduardo Briceño speech, but I've provided those on the unit Padlet for you if you want to access them there. So that's one way that you can access them, and then the other way is to navigate back to our course and to go over here to this link which says Main Unit Padlet's Assignment Sheet and Resources in one place, and click on that. And this will take you to a unit resource Padlet for the Theory unit, and this is just kind of an extra thing. All of the content that is necessary for you to be successful on this paper is located in the Unit 1 module, the Unit 1 folder on Fear, on the main course content page. But a lot of that content is reproduced here in a convenient one-stop shopping kind of place in this Padlet. And remember that if I click on the square icon with the arrow in it, it will make that Padlet full screen. And this is just another way that you could access those TED videos. I have them all in a column here, and they're very easy to access. If I click on one, it brings up a thumbnail view of that, and I could click on it right there and it'll play in that small thumbnail view. But I can also, once it starts playing, I can click in the bottom and I can make the whole thing full screen. So it's just a convenient and quick way for you to access them there. In the next column over, I also have all of the articles that are in this unit, and they're quick and easy to access. This is the first one that we'll be talking about in this unit, Devil's Advocate. And I can click on that and it brings it up. I can read it on screen, I can open it in another window, and I could even download it and print it out if I wanted to. So that's just an extra place where you can find a lot of things that will be useful to you on the paper. But I'm going to go back into the course content. And before we click into that, I'm going to go back to the syllabus so that we can see what it is that we're supposed to be looking at in the unit module. So if we look at what's coming up next, we should be looking in the folder called Critical Reading, and underneath that we need to read the lecture notes, watch a video called Being an Active Reader, and do the two readings called Devil's Advocate and Petrified Forest. And all these things are in our unit module. So remember that it's important that you're looking at the syllabus to see what it is you need to be reading, watching, or doing at any given point in the unit and the given week that we happen to be in. Alright, so I'm in the module, and remember that I can manipulate the table of contents. I can, kind of arrange it such that you can see more of the text so you can navigate easily to the part that you need. Now at this point, you should have read all of the content in this folder right here, Introduction to the Fear Essay. The same is true for this folder right here, the one on writing modes, exemplification, and thesis development. And we've already watched the TED videos, and you've hopefully taken the video quizzes there, but I also have some things here kind of discussing what it means to interact with the video-based content, and I show you how to make printable transcripts of the TED Talks and some useful things there, including the transcript for the Eduardo Briceño TED Talk and the one for the J.K. Rowling TED Talk. But at this point, we're on the one for critical reading, so we need to make sure that we're reading the lecture notes, watching the video here, and doing the 2 assigned readings. This little link right here in between kind of bridges the gap between Devil's Advocate and Petrified Forest, and it goes over some techniques and provides an example of how you can process some text that might be a little bit more difficult to process the first time through that you read them. So if I go ahead and click on Devil's Advocate, we'll see that this article comes up here and you can read it in line. I think you would definitely want to collapse the table of contents so that you can see it a little bit better. And remember that you can click on the blue link to bring it up in as downloaded as a file. You can bring it up in full screen and be able to print it and those kind of things. But what I want to talk about is this notion of active reading. So let me navigate to and bring up a file that I have already annotated, and this is my copy of Devil's Advocate, and I have already annotated this, and it's not a very difficult little article to read. It's actually an excerpt from a book, and the reason that I know this is because when you navigate to the end of these articles from the Lapham's Quarterly Journal, which is where I got all of these articles from, except for one, and that is 10 Ways We Get the Odds Wrong. But all the rest of the articles came from the same journal, which is a Lapham's Quarterly Journal, and it's specifically from the issue on fear. But this is a little 2-page excerpt from a book by Emma Reyes, a memoir. And at the end of each of the Lapham's Quarterly articles is kind of an overview of where it came from and a little bit about what it's about and about the author who wrote it. And so that's always a good thing to be mindful of, because it will kind of provide some context and it may be useful to you when you start annotating the article. So let me scroll back here to the top, and so the first time you read it through, maybe you want to read it through just to kind of get a sense of what it's about. But then when you start to annotate it, that means when you actually write on the article itself, and this is where you have a pen in hand, and you do things like you underline, you circle, you bracket off things that seem important or that catch your attention in some way. But the most important aspect of annotating an article is to mark it up in the white spaces. Whatever white space you have, sometimes on an article like this one, for much of it, maybe you don't have a lot of space and you have to kind of squeeze it in the best that you can, but you're doing a couple of things. Number one, sometimes you're writing just a single word out in the margin to remind yourself of what that paragraph is about. And in other cases, you might be writing phrases or even little sentences where you're either summarizing what's going on in that paragraph, or maybe you're responding, reacting, putting some kind of opinion, observation, insight out to the side. Maybe you're doing like this in the top kind of right side of the article. Maybe you're noting something that's ironic and you're kind of just jotting down a reaction there. Now what this will do is this will allow you to locate information quickly if you need it. And it will also help you process the information that is there, especially if you're responding and reacting and kind of doing something with the text that's there. So let me see if I can find an example, and there's one here at the bottom. Now, if you've already read this article or this excerpt from the book, then you know that there's not much going on there in terms of a plot. This is an excerpt from a book. It's a childhood memory by the woman who wrote this book of the time that she spent in a Catholic school and convent in Colombia when she was a child, and she and her sister were orphans, and they lived in this convent and they went to school there. And she's recounting a memory of one of her favorite nuns who would always tell them stories about the devil and about hell and about all the horrible things that were going to happen to them if they misbehave or if they sinned in any way. And it's about that. and about a specific time that she remembers where the nun was telling such a vivid story of, what the devil was going to do to them, that when a cat kind of jumped out from nowhere, it of course scared the girls half to death, and they kind of clambered and grabbed for, whatever piece of Sister Dolores, the name of the nun, that they could get, and, they kind of practically tackled her. And so that's kind of the sum total of it. But the excerpt has so much more to it to offer in terms of us exploring not only what it means to annotate an article, but also just kind of exploring this kind of concept of fear and how it permeates our lives in so many ways and how it is utilized in so many ways. So before we get into that, let me point to this place here that I have commented on, and this is a place where she's talking about Sister Dolores, and she said she never hit us, never yelled, never humiliated us. And when I was reading this, I bracketed that off because I thought it was odd, because I thought, well, why would she do those things? She is their teacher, she is a nun. You would think you would not expect her to ever do those kind of things. So I found it kind of odd that she put that in there. And I put a note to myself out to the side that says, this seems to imply that other nuns did do these things. And just a moment ago, I pointed out the kind of little excerpt at the end that gives you a little bit of background about the author. And I noticed here that it says that when Reyes and her sister grew up in this convent, that they were locked away and forced to work long hours. So that implies that, they were not treated well on the whole. However, I wrote a note pointing out that Sister Dolores in this excerpt is described in very positive terms, but it seems like there were other nuns that maybe didn't treat the children as well, and that maybe Sister Dolores is an exception rather than the rule, or at least that there were some other nuns that were a bit mean to the children, that maybe they hit them sometimes, they yelled sometimes, and perhaps humiliated the children at various points in time. Okay, so you're going through the article and you're noting, various things. Again, sometimes keyword summaries, other times you're responding and reacting. And I'm noting a lot of the imagery that's used in this. There's a lot of very vivid imagery, very graphic imagery about hell and the devil. And of course, she's telling these stories as if these things will really happen to the children. She says that if you sinned with your eyes, the devil would remove them with hot needles. So this is pretty graphic and pretty scary if you've got small children. And, as we know, these things are not really going to happen, but the children don't necessarily know that because this is kind of all that they have known. If we go back to the beginning of the article, we see that, the first couple of lines say, our lives had no future, our only ambition being to go from the convent directly to heaven, untouched by the world. So, that suggests to me that, this is the only world that the children know, is that of the church. And very shortly thereafter that, we see that, she says that their only enemy was the devil. We knew everything about him. In fact, we knew more about the devil than about God. And that's the part that I underlined and found it ironic, because in a church, and when the focus is on God and heaven and getting there and being pious and good and holy and all those sorts of things, we would think that the children would be taught more about God than anything else. So it's a little bit ironic that she recounts the fact that they knew more about the devil than about God. And if we kind of step back for a moment and we look at the bigger picture of what's going on here, we might ask ourselves, well, why is Sister Dolores telling the children these stories about the devil and what's going to happen to them and doing things to kind of purposely scare them? And we might be able to ascertain, well, the whole point of that is to get the children to behave, to get them to believe in not only all the things that they're being taught about God, but being taught also that there are consequences for bad actions, bad thoughts, and things like that. But the consequences are being given a face and a name and a context, a place. And so to the children, this is all very, very real and very, very frightening. And it's designed to control their behavior and to also help control their belief systems as well. So this is a means of control. This, this excerpt here is about somebody, Sister Dolores, who is an agent of the church using fear for a very specific purpose. And so we can ask ourselves about that a little bit later. But first you kind of have to go through and process the minutia of the article and to kind of go through and see what she's doing, how she's going about doing it, and what kind of impact that's having on the children. So as I'm going through here, I'm noticing some other things about Sister Dolores, about how, she is described in kind of glowing terms, and she's gentle in her reprimands and guidance to any of the girls. And she is described here on the second page as telling these stories almost as if she is a performer on the stage. So I made note of some things where it says the devil was her favorite character and role. Those are terms you might use in a drama class to describe somebody who is performing a character, kind of putting on a show. And this allowed her to show off, her great dramatic skills to achieve a certain effect. And then there's description that I bracketed off about how she would twist her mouth in all these directions. She would make the moans and the bellows, and her eyes, which were usually so sweet, they would jump from their orbits, darting in all directions, and her voice took on every nuance. So she's doing a lot of the same things that many of us might do if we were reading a story to smaller children, if we wanted to really bring it to life. So she's doing all of these things. And then we see that kind of at the height of this story that she's kind of remembering, that when the story is at its kind of climax and it's at its highest point, these two cats that were always locked in the bakery, they escaped and they chased each other, and kind of their sudden appearance scared the children. It startled them in the midst of this very kind of scary story that Sister Dolores was telling them. And out of sheer fright, they all kind of clamber and scramble and grab for any piece of Sister Dolores that they can, and they kind of topple her to the ground. So they practically tackle her out of a sense of fear. So in the grand scheme of things, there's not a lot going on here in terms of the who, what, where, when, and why. Kind of the story here is just a simple little excerpt. But, what's really important is what we can do with it after the fact. So I didn't have a whole lot of room to make a lot of annotations on the actual article itself, but I did have room on the very last page where there was a lot of white space so that I could ask questions, I could write further things, and I may go back and add to these things. But what I did is I thought about what I read and I asked myself, what does this have to do with fear? What does it say about fear? What does it reveal? What do I think about that? So those are the things that I'm thinking about. And so I jotted down some questions, and if we were in a face-to-face class, these are some of the questions that I would bring in and I would pose to the class, and hopefully the class would then chime in and pose their own questions and share their thoughts on various aspects of the story, and also point to places in the text that they marked and found interesting, or that they had a question about or a comment about. So let's look at some of the things that I pointed to, and so this will hopefully give you an example of the kinds of things that you can do, not only with this article, but with, all of the other ones that we read. This is exactly the kind of thing you need to do with everything that you need to read for this class, and ideally this is what you should be doing for the things that you read for your other classes, because this helps you process the content, and it also helps you figure out what you think about the content, which is very important. The whole point of going to college is not just to read and regurgitate and tell somebody, well, this is what it was about, but the whole point is to weigh in on that and to be able to formulate your own opinions about things, to defend them, to ask questions, and to engage in discussion about these things with other people. So just as I mentioned a few minutes earlier, my first question that I kind of posed, started out with an observation that Sister Dolores uses fear to control the children and shape their beliefs, and the idea that many religions do this. They use fear to control behavior and shape beliefs, but then that made me kind of pose the question and ask, is this necessary? Is it morally right? Is it right for Sister Dolores to lie to the children and terrify them? Because, it is true that, if the children sin with their eyes, if they look with envy at something that somebody else has, the devil's not really going to appear and, poke out their eyes with red hot pokers and all of those kind of things. So it is a lie to tell the children that those things are going to happen to them. And so I'm asking myself and the class, is that right? For her to do that, is that right for religions to do these kinds of things, to shape our fears, to get us to kind of walk the path of the straight and narrow, to behave the way that we're supposed to? And so that is, maybe one thing to think about. And then that makes me think about, well, what other institutions and businesses besides churches use fear to control others or to influence their thinking and behavior? This gives us opportunity to discuss these things, to talk about them, but it also gives opportunity, even when you're thinking about these things on your own, to write further about these. So even this act of reading articles actively and annotating, asking questions and things like that, it gives you further opportunity to pre-write on the subject of fear, because you could answer these questions for yourself, or you could answer these questions in conversation with others, or you could pose these questions or other questions and enter into conversation with others about these things. All right, another question that I have, or that I came up with as I was reading this, is to what extent do or have parents used fear in a similar fashion in raising their children? So I think about this as a parent. To what extent did I, as a parent, did I ever use fear to get, my daughter to behave or to do something that I wanted her to? And that doesn't have to be anything dramatic. It could be anything as simple as, telling your kids that if they don't behave and do as they're asked, that maybe Santa Claus won't come and visit them at Christmas time. It could be the threat of, taking away a favorite toy, just some kind of consequence for these kind of things, or other kind of punishments, timeouts and things like that. So to what extent do parents use fear, in raising their children, and then asking, the extent to which that is acceptable or not? Is it necessary to use fear at times in order to get children to behave or comply? And then that makes me kind of extrapolate out and ask that question for us as a whole. Do we have to have fear as a mechanism in place to get us to behave, to get us to do things that are right, that are, morally appropriate, that are in the common good? So my last question that I have asked thus far is, to what extent do governments and society use or need to use fear of punishment in order for people to behave justly and for the common good? And then that makes me ask, well, what is it that makes or prompts people to be good or behave morally and for the common good? Are we born good, or do we have to be conditioned to be that way? And I think that's a big question that we could discuss and debate, and that you can discuss and debate amongst yourselves, in groups when you discuss some of these readings. And this reminds me of a movie called Hollow Man. And you probably haven't seen this, and it's not the best movie in the world, but it's an older movie, and it's, kind of one of those Invisible Man movies where there's a scientist and he experiments on himself and he becomes invisible. And throughout the course of the movie, he kind of deteriorates as a character, as a person, because since he's invisible, he can get away with things that he would not be able to get away with if people could see him. And so it kind of becomes a question of, what is it that, kind of compels us to be good or to do things that we're supposed to. And, the movie seems to suggest or imply that, You know, if people aren't watching and if there aren't any repercussions or consequences, that we too might, you know, deteriorate, or our character might deteriorate, and we might do things that we otherwise would not. And so these are all really big kind of philosophical questions. And to be honest, this little article right here, this excerpt from the book, it's really good for class discussion. It's really good to illustrate the concept of what it is you are doing when you are annotating an article. It may not be one that you end up choosing to use in your paper, because the two prompts that I provide you are how can we overcome our fears, specifically the ones that might hold us back, and the other one is what can we learn from our fears or from our response to fears, or what can they teach us. So neither one of those prompts lends itself to the use of this particular article. I don't know that you would come up with anything on your own that might make use of this, that would also make use of the other sources that we have available in this unit. So it's really good for these other things. It may or may not be something that you use in your paper. I think for most people it's not something that would lend itself to that, but it's really great for discussion, and it's really great for illustrating what it is that we're talking about. We're talking about annotating the article. So before I wrap this video up, I want to say a few things about the process of annotating. The process of annotating, or writing on your text, it slows down your reading a little bit. It wouldn't take very long at all to read this little 2-page article, to run your eyes over it, and to say, yeah, okay, I read it, I know what it's about, big deal, you know, what are we doing with it? But that's not going to be very useful to you when it comes time to preparing for, say, a class discussion that you may be having, and it's not very useful to you if you happen to be reading an article that you end up using in some way in the paper that we'll be writing in this unit. And so the process of annotating helps you process the content. It helps you remember it, and it slows the reading process down enough such that you can respond and react to the things that you're reading, which is probably one of the most important things that you need to do in general and in life, but also, you know, in kind of the college environment. You want to respond and react to the things that you read. You don't just want to parrot back what it says and know what it's about. You have to ask yourself, well, so what? What's the big deal? How does this relate to what we're learning, what we're talking about? What do I think about it? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? And you think about what you can extrapolate, what you can pull out of it. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about annotating an article, and this is what I want you to do for all the things that you need to read in this class, and especially for the things that you end up choosing to use in your papers. And this is also true for the TED Talks that you end up choosing to use. Ideally, you should mark those transcripts up, but only after you've watched the videos and you know what they are about. And I think that those of you who've taken the video quizzes have processed those fairly well. But the nice thing about having the transcript and about marking it up, like I've marked up this article here, is that again you can go back and you can quickly find the things that you are looking for, and you've also gone back and you've read more carefully what you listened to the first time, and now you're responding, you're reacting, you're adding your notes in the margin, you are underlining, circling, bracketing things off, and in the white space in between and in the white space at the end or on another sheet of paper, you're able to write down your questions, your comments, you're able to answer your questions, do some more, you know, kind of writing on the subject of whatever comes up on that, and all of that can be very, very useful to you when it comes time to writing the paper. All right, so that's it. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about annotating an article. And so I will stop the video there for now because I think this illustrates the point.